there is a place where people who live there don't keep score, where there's no such thing as an enemy, where tomorrow is just another day, and the moment at hand matters most. A place where people live for more than applause. Welcome to the city.
I am a Palestinian Christian, and I have lived all of my life in Bethlehem. Today, Bethlehem is a city that is completely surrounded by walls and fences. The wall just completely engulfs the city. Living in the wall is like living in a big prison, where you are deemed guilty. We grew up in a culture where we were called to hate Israelis for what they were doing to us. Every Israeli to me was a bad person who was occupying us, wanted to destroy us. And I learned that I can stand up for my rights and stand up for my dignity, and I can resist those who are occupying me, but doing it non-violently, without being violent to them. And I felt that this was the right thing to do. I would even say that this is what Jesus would be doing if he was in my place. Jesus would be standing with the victim against the victimizer, with the oppressed against the oppressor, with the occupied against the occupier. But part of my journey was to begin to really understand that my faith calls me to engage in much more. The time that Jesus lived in, he and his Jewish community were also living under a very suppressive occupation, the Roman occupation. And Jesus could have said anything to the Jewish community at that time. He could have said, we should make peace with our enemies. He could have said we should negotiate with our enemies. We should resolve our conflict with our enemies. He could have called his people to do that, and people would have been maybe very upset with him, and they would have maybe even labeled him as a traitor. Jesus went beyond all of this. He called us to love. What Jesus calls us to do is not just to make peace and then step away. He calls us into unity. He calls us into oneness. When you love somebody, when you love a member of your family, when you love your wife, your husband, you create a new oneness with them, a unity with them, where there is no other actually. The challenge to all of us is, how are we living this globally as well? And I believe that the teachings of Jesus have the answers that the world is looking for. We are just called out to live them. We're not called to just make peace. We are called to create a beloved community of all the peoples of this land. And that, for me, is what loving the enemy is all about.
I don't know about you, but for me, I have found Christianity to be very confusing lately. When you turn on the news and watch what's happening in our world, and you see that everybody's taking a side about this and that and everything in between, and it's hard to know as a Christian, what side am I supposed to be on? Who am I supposed to agree with? Who am I supposed to fight with? Because there's something in us, just as human beings, set Christianity aside, just as human beings that want to know we're on a side. We want to know that we're in a fight and that we're on this place or the side of the line that has got a chance at winning. There's just something in us that wants that. In fact, sociologists have become so intrigued by that part of how we're wired that they did a study recently. And this is the headline of the report that they wrote. It said, having enemies makes life better. That made everybody tune in. Having enemies makes life better? I thought that we believed that having enemies wasn't right, and now there's a bunch of really smart people with a lot of letters after their name saying that it actually makes life better. Now, here's what's interesting. In this study, they unpack why it makes our life better. It's not necessarily better in good ways. It's just better in the sense that it kind of scratches where we itch. You see, having enemies provides a sense of convergence. Here's what I mean by convergence. An enemy provides a rallying point, and it brings people together, and we kind of link arms around that thing and feel really good about that we're unified against this one thing. And we unify more easily around something we're against than something we're for. This is why you will hear Bears fans say that they actually have two favorite teams: the Chicago Bears and anybody playing the Green Bay Packers. You've heard this, right? That's the enemy. We don't care that the Bears are good or bad. We just want the Packers to lose. And that's kind of the definition of a Bears fan these days especially, right? But we converge around that idea. Having that common enemy gives us that sense, and we love knowing and feeling like we're not in something by ourselves. So in that sense, having an enemy makes life better. It also provides a sense of coherence. It helps us make sense of the world. It gives us an explanation for why things are the way that they are. It makes us feel better about bad things happening to us or things not going the way that we drew them up. This is why no matter what the issue is, one political party will always blame the other political party. Have you ever noticed that? This is how it works. We have to have an enemy, because if we can throw, this at them and make this about their fault and their wrongdoing, then we feel like we're winning, and that's a good feeling. And at least it makes sense. At least we have an explanation for why things are the way that they are. So in that sense, it makes life a little bit better. And then finally, having enemies provides us a sense of competence. It bolsters this part of us that wants to feel right. And if we have an enemy, we can look at that enemy and go, well, at least we're not as bad as them. And if we're not as bad as them, then we feel good about us, we're right. Having enemies is good. This is in all of us. You have maybe gone to church your entire life, and you are just under Mother Teresa, and you are awesome, but there is a part of you that is starved for a sense of convergence, coherence, and competency. In fact, the studies showed that human beings will actually create enemies in their life to feed this part of their needs. That even though somebody may not deserve that title, may not be openly against someone, we will view them as our enemies so that we get what we're looking for in life, so that our life is made better. So it's no wonder at all that we get really confused as people when Jesus drops this little gospel grenade on our lap. Love your enemy. What? What do you mean, love them? Fighting against them actually makes me feel good. Winning feels good. Being right feels good. Being unified against someone feels good. So Jesus, when you come along and you say I'm supposed to love my enemy, that turns my whole worldview upside down. That changes the way I have to think about everything in my life. And Jesus goes, yes, it does, and it should. Jesus, this doesn't make any sense. By definition, you can't love an enemy. And I think Jesus looks at you and I and he goes, listen, in the city on a hill, nothing makes sense. In this place, we do things so differently that it seems different and opposite from every other city on the planet. You are to love your enemy. So today, we're going to look at this part of what's called the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus unpacks this a little bit. And I warned you last week, I'll warn you now, this is really intense. And this has bothered me all week, the passage that we're going to look at. Because I'm very human too, and I love all of those parts that having an enemy gives me. And Jesus comes along and he says, I'm sending you in the opposite direction. Now, if you want to follow along, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 5, if you want to pull open your own Bible or up on your phone, however you want to do that. Matthew chapter 5, and as we're reading this, I want you as best you can to really try and be there. Be there and hear Jesus say these words. Because the longer you're in church, the easier it is to read through Matthew 5 and just, here's Jesus talking, and we kind of get on to the next chapter. But if we were to really sit in this and really think about the ramifications of what Jesus is saying, you would understand why people sitting on that hill in that day listening to him say these things would be so upset. So, Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 43. Jesus says, you've heard the law that says, we started here last week. Jesus does this really regularly. He says, you've heard it said this way, or you've heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now stop right there. If you've ever read the Old Testament at all, you're having a hard time with what Jesus said, because when you hear the law, and when I hear the law, I think Torah, first 5 books of the Old Testament. And I've read those, and I've never found this part of what Jesus said, hate your enemy. There's a few places along the way where I pick up on that we're supposed to love our neighbor, but I've never heard Jesus say, or God say, in the 10 Commandments or anything like that I should hate my enemy. But what is so cool about Jesus, what he does so well, is he doesn't just talk to one audience, he talks to all the people that are sitting in the room, and he understands where all of those people are coming from. And even if you'd never grown up in a like strict, I memorized the Torah kind of household, you would have heard something along these lines. The second part, though, would have come from a sect of Judaism known as the Essene Jews. And they lived in a part of Israel called the Qumran area. And it's a desert, mountainous region. This is actually where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls a few decades back, some of the oldest manuscripts we have of the Bible. But the Essene Jews were really interesting people. They had kind of removed themselves from society, and they were beginning to see everything in black and white. Everything was either or, everything was versus. And so they drew really hard lines on things so that their understanding of the world was clear, and it made sense. And they had a part, we actually found it with the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was called the Rule of Community. And in the Rule of Community, they say these words: love all sons of light, hate all sons of darkness. This is where the second part of what Jesus says is coming from. This has kind of permeated out into the normal ways of doing society. We love the people that are in with us. We hate the people that are out of us. And this is very black and white, right? White and black. Love the sons of light, the people that are just like you, hate everybody else. And we think that when we hear the word neighbor, just like they probably did, that means friendly. So love the people that are friendly with you, which leaves permission for this, I guess. But Jesus says, listen, you've heard it said that way for however long now. But I need to tell you what that actually means and what citizenship in this city actually looks like. This is what he says in the very next verse, verse 44. But I say, and remember, Jesus isn't just changing our perspective on something, he's deepening the intensity of our response to that something. He says, but I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Jesus says, don't just love the sons of light, love the sons of darkness too. When Jesus says love your enemies, he says love indiscriminately. Draw no distinction between your friends and your enemies. Draw no line between your neighbors and outsiders. You're to love everybody. Now, in our modern age, we have adopted a very broad definition of enemy. We think of enemy as anybody that's even slightly different from us, right? We just think in extremes all the time. If you don't believe exactly like me and look like me and do like me and talk like me, then you're against me, is kind of how we naturally think. And because that's so wishy-washy and subjective, it's easy to sometimes go, well, I'll love my enemy, that's okay. I mean, they basically just live next door to me. But we have to understand what Jesus is talking about. When Jesus is talking about an enemy, he's talking about someone who's on the total opposite end of the spectrum from you. In fact, he would say an enemy is someone who openly opposes you, who wants to do harm to you, who wants to see you lose. What Jesus does right here is he pushes the limits of this spectrum to almost boundaryless lengths. In other words, there is no one anywhere on the planet who does not fit somewhere in between you and that extreme definition of an enemy. You are to love everybody, friendly or foe. We don't get to draw a line, not even a dotted line between them. And oh, by the way, just in case you think Jesus is being unfair, he lived this. This was his example. Do you remember what Paul said? While we were still his enemy, Christ died for us. Christ loved us, even when we opposed him. Again, I keep coming back to this. My favorite part about Jesus is he never asks us to do anything that he didn't do in front of us. So Jesus loved his enemies. God so loved the world, not just the people that were like him or liked him. And so he says, listen, the spectrum here is really big. So if you're going to be a citizen in the city on a hill, you're going to have to love differently. And what Jesus calls us to do is to love people not based on them, but based on him. We love in the city, we don't love people based on who they are, on their merit, or what they do or don't deserve. We love people based on Jesus, period. We love people because Jesus loved us, and he was indiscriminate with his love. So we have to be indiscriminate with ours. If we're going to follow in his footsteps, if we're going to be like him, if we are going to be the city on the hill that shines out light so that other people pick up on the God colors in the world, it does not happen in a fight. It happens through love. That's what Jesus taught us. If we're going to bring out the God flavor in the world, it's going to be through love. And Jesus says the whole point of all this, if you read on into the verse 45, you start to see that the whole point of this is not so that people will think we're awesome, but so that people will think he is. Listen to verse 45. In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. For he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. If you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you're kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. I love it when Jesus gets a little like, I'm going to get you here. And what he does so brilliantly is he picks a group of people that every Jew hated. He says, you're no better than the tax collectors. Did you catch it when he said that? Now, if you don't know what a tax collector is back in this century, here's who they were. They were Jews that worked for the Romans. They literally had turned to the dark side and were serving the empire. And these Jews would walk up to other Jews' homes and knock on the door and demand their tax money to give to Rome. So in my mind, anybody that lived then, who you hated more than Rome was the Jews who worked for Rome. They were real enemies. Now, what that meant for the tax collectors was they would have to kind of isolate themselves and insulate themselves, because nobody wants to get out there in front of the firing squad and people throwing tomatoes at you and saying things about you. So they would get together and they would huddle up. They were each other's best friends. They were like the first real deal clique, the tax collectors. They had their own way of life, and they just kind of left everybody on the outside. And so when Jesus says, listen, if you don't love people that are your enemies, you're just like them, you know. And right then, people were like, where is a rock? I can't believe he said that. I'm nothing like them. The truth is, you and I today, I am. I love my people where it's comfortable. They think like me, they talk like me, they believe like me. It's easy to just huddle up and stay close and protect each other. But Jesus says, that's not what I've called you to do. What I've called you to do is love outsiders like they're insiders. Notice that. He starts with love your neighbor, and he says, hate your enemy, but we're going to flip that, and I want you to love your enemy like your neighbor. I want you to redefine people in your mind. I want you to change the label that they carry. And I don't want you to just not swing at them. I don't want you to just not hate them. I want you to actually have a desire for their good. I know it's easy to hear a preacher say that, but think about this for a minute. When was the last time where you had your mortal enemy's face in your head and you thought, I earnestly want the best for them? Come on. Don't fool yourself. None of us think this way. Jesus says, I want you to love them. And here's why. This is why he says, in that way. That's how he started this. He says, in that way, or so that. The reason that we're doing all this, why this is so important, why you're going to be so upside down from everybody else in your life, the reason for that is you will then live as children of your Father. Remember the whole point of the city. The city is to show the world who God is. And so Jesus says, when you love your enemy, when you don't draw lines between people, and you love them the way I'm telling you to love them, they get a taste of who God is. You bring out the God flavors in the world. When you love people the way I'm telling you to love people, they begin to see the light. They begin to see God for who he really is. And it doesn't come when you give a really convincing argument. It comes when you love them selflessly and you actually desire good for them and the best for them. This is why Jesus says in John chapter 13, your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. I can't get over this idea. I've gone to church my whole life, and this seems wishy-washy. This seems light and easy. It can't really be just love people like crazy, can it? Jesus says, well, it's that easy when you like them, but I want you to love the people you don't like too. I want you to love the people on the other side of the aisle. I want you to love people on the other side of the border. I want you to love people on the other side of the world. I want you to love people who don't think anything like you, because they have no chance of getting to know the real me if you don't show them the real me. So in the city, we don't love based on them. It's not about their merit. It's not about whether or not they deserve it. And I know as Christians, we agree with this and we nod along, but we spend a lot of time grading people on their lovability. Do they deserve this? Did they get a passing grade for me to treat them kindly and for me to love them? But Jesus says, no, it's not based on them. It's based on me. We love people based on Jesus, based on who he is. So when I look at people, I'm not supposed to see their face. I'm supposed to see his. And when I feel like they're out to get me, I'm supposed to understand that the only way to change that dynamic is to selflessly love them and want what's good for them. Christianity's hard. It's harder than we think, and it's not for the reasons that we think. It's because Jesus calls us to go against our very DNA hardwired self and love people that seem unlovable. And what Jesus says next as he wraps this portion up is one of the verses that I know I'm going to get to see him face to face one day, but if he gives me like an hour out of eternity to sit and talk about some of the things that he said, I'm going to ask him why he said what we're about to read. And I'm going to say, couldn't you have left that part out? Because I struggled my whole life with that verse. This is what he says. You are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Jesus, you want me to be something I cannot be? Even the most narcissistic, egotistical people in the world will say, well, no, I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect. We kind of understand this. And Jesus says, you're to be perfect. The total crazy idea is that God wants you and I to be just like him, knowing that we don't have a shot. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, it's important to understand what he is and what he isn't saying, and it's taken me a long time to even start to understand this. I think sometimes when we hear be perfect, in our day and age, we say, okay, perfect attendance at church, perfect clean language, perfect never cheating on my taxes, perfect reading my Bible every day, perfect saying a prayer here and there, perfect in the tasks of Christianity. But we are not talking about the tasks of Christianity in this passage. We're talking about the nature of Christianity, who we're supposed to be, and the whole thing has been about we're to love our enemy. So if we want to be perfect, that's how we love our enemy, or that's how we do it. We love our enemy. Now, here's some good news, a little bit of hope for you and I. Greek is a very complex language. And sometimes it doesn't translate very well to English. And so we've taken this Greek word, teleos, and we've translated it to perfect. Now, here's what's cool about the Greek language is one word can have a whole lot of depth and a whole lot of variety in its meaning. And what it doesn't really mean is perfect. What it has more to do with is wholeness, completeness. An integrated life where you feel like it's working together and I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing and I'm living according to my design in my life and I feel at home in my own skin. It's completeness. It could also mean that you arrived at the destination that you've been traveling toward. And so the idea of what Jesus is getting at is that if you want to be whole, if you want to be complete, then you got to love your enemy too. You can't just love one side of the line. I think Jesus might put it this way. We are most integrated with God when we're most indiscriminate with love. I was a youth pastor for 10 years, and right about this time every year, high school students that are seniors will come to me and they'll say, Josh, I just want to know what God wants me to do with my life. And I was pretty dumb with my answers back then. I'm not very wise today, but I'm a little wiser than I was a few years back. And I wish I would have thought to tell them this. I can tell you exactly what God wants you to do with your life. Love people like crazy. And the good news is you can do that if you're a pastor. You can do that if you're a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. You can do that if you're a teacher. You can do that if you're a stay-at-home mom. You can do that if you're self-employed. You can do that if you're jobless. What God wants you to do, how to be most integrated with his will for your life, is to just love people. Just love everybody. Whether they're on the same side of the tracks as you or not. That's how you live in the will of God. Because in the city on a hill, we don't love based on them. We love based on him. We love because of who Jesus is. I'm totally convinced that the best gospel tracts in all of the world are you and me. And I think the best way that we communicate the gospel is in this way. I think if we were to get this right and do this the way that Jesus is calling us to do this, eventually somebody's going to go, hey, can I ask you something? Why do you love me? I wanted your job, you know. My dog made a mess in your backyard. I left you. Why do you love me? And the good news is we could look at him and say, well, it has nothing to do with you. I love you because of him. And let me tell you about him and how much he loves you. That's a much better way to come at this, I think, than to say all the time, you're my enemy, and I'm going to make sure you know you're my enemy. I think what we have to do is begin to create in ourselves and in other people what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. I dare you to try and say that 20 times fast. Cognitive dissonance is this thing that our brains do to make us feel better about what we do. We will retroactively begin to like something because we want our actions to be congruent with how we feel. Now, this is how it works. You see the commercial on TV for the brand new iPhone, and you see that the price tag is $1,000. And you just gotta have it. Now, this is maybe me. You're probably way smarter with your money than me. You just think, I gotta run out and I gotta spend that money and I gotta get it. And then you get home and you have what they call buyer's remorse. Like, oh my gosh, this did not change my life like they told me it would on the commercial. But you don't want your friends to know. You can't let your friends or your family know that this is a disappointment. And so what you do is you begin to accentuate the merit of the purchase. You begin telling yourself it was worth it because your brain can't disagree with what you did. And so you will rewire your thinking and you will rewire how you talk about things so everybody else assumes this really did change your life, even though on the inside you're going, no, it didn't. So what would it look like if you and I started creating cognitive dissonance in all of our relationships where people started going, you don't add up with the Christians I've known my whole life. And maybe they start to think differently about Christians because of how you interact with them. Or maybe for you and I, when we start loving people in tangible ways, even people that we don't agree with, our own cognition begins to change. Because the best way to get rid of any enemy is to make them your neighbor. It's not to defeat them or win, it's to relabel them. They're my neighbor, and so I love them. And all of a sudden, your hands and your feet will be doing things that don't make sense to your brain, and your brain's going to have to go, I give. I think of them differently now. What I think cognitive dissonance teaches us is that action before adoration develops affection. You go and you do that thing before you really understand or appreciate or know all of what it is, and over time, your brain will start to back up what you do. And you'll start to love that thing. So what would happen if you and I started actively loving people even before we actually loved them? Your brain is going to change. And you will begin to see them differently. And nobody understood this better than Jesus himself. In one of the other Gospels called Luke, when he's giving this same part of this same sermon, he expounds a little bit on this idea of loving your enemy. This is what he says in Luke chapter 6. He says, I say love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. Don't just not say bad things about them. Go and do things that are for their good. That's how you change an enemy into a neighbor. Christianity is not about we're just going to be PC and we're not going to say things and we're not going to get on the news and we're not going to do all that stuff. It's not about we're going to fight so that we get on the news and all that kind of stuff. It's about I am going to selflessly love you. I'm not going to be salt in the sense of salt in the wound. I'm going to be salt in the sense of salt for healing. I will not kill you with kindness. I'll heal you with kindness. That's what it means to love an enemy. That's what Jesus calls us to. Do good, bless them, pray for them. When was the last time you prayed for your enemies? I would hate to admit to you. You know why? Because I don't remember. But Jesus calls us to something more intense than just loving our neighbors. How do we actually go about doing this? Like, is there a strategy, or is it just I start, and is this just we condone everything? We don't have any problem, No, it's not that at all. Loving somebody does not mean that you agree with somebody all the time. right? So let's not go ahead and draw that line unnecessarily. Jesus doesn't agree with everything I do. He loves me through it, though. So the strategy I want to give you is actually not from the scriptures at all, but I think it was stolen from the scriptures by a man named Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was known for not having a whole lot of enemies. He seemed to be able to work a room and work out an agreement and all of these kinds of things. And it was so intense that people started studying how he did life. And they gave it a name. They called it the Benjamin Franklin effect. And here's how he said, they asked him, they go, how do you do this? What's your strategy? And he says, it's really easy. I find an enemy, and I ask them to help me with something. I ask for their assistance in a task that I'm trying to complete. And he went on to explain, without using cognitive dissonance, but the same principle, he said, they will not be able to help me and continue to think of me in the same way. Their brain will have to catch up with their hands. And so the best way is to just invite them into what I'm doing. And I wonder what it would look like for Christians to start doing that. I want to give you 2 questions to chew on this week. Number 1, what enemy do you need to create some cognitive dissonance with this week? For some of you, this is a coworker. For some of you, this is a classmate. For some of you, this is your spouse. For some of you, this is your kid. For some of you, this is the neighbor. You fill in the blank of who the enemy is. But what would it look like for you to create cognitive dissonance in their mind and in yours? Where you loved them in a tangible way. Like I'm not just talking about, okay, I'll stop talking about them. I'm saying you go out of your way to express to them that you actually do love them and that you want the good in their life for them. What would that look like? You might start to think of them differently, and they might start to think of you differently, all because you brought them a plate of cookies. Or you went a few extra rows in mowing your grass over into their property. Simple little things that all of a sudden your brain's going to have to catch up. The second question is this: what outsider can you ask to help you with an insider task this week? This is really profound for Christians. One of my favorite things to do is invite someone to do a volunteer role here at the church, and they say to me, well, I don't know that I've totally bought into this Christianity thing yet. I say, well, that's okay. I still need your help. Because what I want to show them is I love you no matter what. I like you no matter what. It's not based on your merits. I love you because of who he is. That's what Jesus taught me, is he loved me regardless of me. This is who he was. Wrestle with that question. Who's an outsider that you can invite to help you with some insider task? Because in the city, we don't love based on them. We love based on him. And isn't it interesting that Jesus invites you and I to participate in what he's doing? Isn't it interesting that Jesus called 12 disciples instead of just doing it on his own? And he could have, but he invited helpers along. And even today, he invites helpers along. Because what Jesus has shown over the course of 2,000 years is that when you begin to eliminate enemies and you start to make them neighbors, things grow. I mean, imagine for a minute what it would look like in your life if you didn't have any enemies anymore and it didn't require you to win a single fight. All it required was for you to start loving on them and kind of retroactively rewiring your thinking about them. What would it look like if you stopped loving them based on them or not loving them based on them, and you just started loving them the way Jesus loves you? I can tell you what would happen. This city we've been talking about, this location, this city on a hill that we are, would grow. And eventually I think we would have to rename it because the city would expand and we might have to call it a county. We might have to say to Jesus, can we call ourselves the county on the hill? Because we've been loving people like crazy, and they keep showing up for more. This seems to be clicking for them in ways it didn't before. We've kind of grown beyond the limits of the city. I think Jesus would go, yeah, keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it, because eventually the county would grow and we would start to have to call it the kingdom. And so we pray this prayer all the time. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's a prayer that puts a lot of action responsibility on you and I. Not to win a battle, but to love like Jesus loved. That's when he said the kingdom is near, it was because the cross was in view. The ultimate act of love for the good of an enemy. That is what it means to be a citizen in the city. Will you pray with me? Lord, this is one of those Sundays where we might understand and we might even agree with this principle, but it's going to be really, really difficult to do it. But you've called us to more than tax collector kind of living. You've called us to more than just being like the norm. You've called us to be people who love indiscriminately, who don't draw lines and don't draw distinctions and don't base it on merit, but just base it on who you are. And so we want to live into that this week, but we're going to really, really need your help. Because we recognize that we can't be perfect. We recognize that we don't even have the capacity in our own self to love, because we kind of like having enemies. So help us, Lord, to step outside of our own comfort zone. Help us to step outside of what we feel we need to be okay, and to really pursue who you've called us to be. No matter what context or relationship it is. God, help us to love like you. And Lord, as we get ready to listen to this song, here's my prayer, is that we would listen to the words and that they would sink deep into our heart, and that we would see what you've called us to as an opportunity to see the world the way you see the world. And that while a lot of this seems very challenging and difficult, it's actually what you called life to the fullest. And God, as we listen to that song and then as we give, our prayer is that you would use it in the ways that only you can think to use it. And we just want you to know we're giving it to you. We're not giving it to Emmanuel Church. We're not giving it to some cause. We're giving it to you so that you can continue to spread your kingdom, so that you can continue to make sure that every person in this world knows that you love them. And so, Lord, be honored and blessed and smile on this offering and on this song. We love you. Amen.